My name is Tyler Brooks, and in September 2014, I drove into the Eastern Sierra to explore an abandoned mining camp I had found marked on an old survey map. I had been hiking and photographing historic sites for years. Old cabins, rusted machinery, collapsed shafts. Places people had built quickly and left behind just as fast. Most of them were quiet and ordinary once you got there. Empty wood, sun-bleached metal, wind moving through broken boards. The road into this one was rough but passable. It left the main highway near Bishop and climbed into dry hills covered with sage and scattered pine. After a few miles, the track narrowed, and the ground turned to loose rock. I parked at a wide turn where the road ended and walked the last half-mile with my pack. The camp sat in a shallow basin surrounded by low trees and granite outcrops. 3 cabins remained. One had collapsed into a pile of gray boards. The other 2 still stood, though the roof sagged and the doors hung crooked. A rusted cart lay tipped on its side near a shallow trench that ran toward the slope. There were tailings piles and scraps of cable half buried in dirt. The place looked exactly like the photos I had seen from similar sites. Old but not dramatic. Quiet in a dry, empty way. I chose a flat spot about 30 yards from the cabins and set up my small tent near a cluster of pines. I kept my distance from the structures because old buildings attract rodents and sometimes people. I walked through the area slowly, taking pictures and checking the ground for signs of recent use. I saw no trash, no tire tracks, no footprints that looked fresh. Only deer droppings and the narrow prints of small animals. By late afternoon, the light turned softer and the air cooled. The Sierra evenings drop temperature fast once the sun moves behind the ridges. I collected a few small branches for a short cooking fire and boiled water for a dehydrated meal. The wind stayed calm. No insects, no aircraft, no distant traffic. Just the occasional sound of a bird moving through the trees. I remember noticing how clear every small noise sounded. In places like that, a zipper or a cup touching a rock carries farther than you expect. After eating, I cleaned my metal cup and set it beside my stove. I clicked my lighter to burn off a bit of fuel from the tip. The sound was sharp and quick. A few seconds later, I heard the same click again. It came from somewhere behind me. I turned and looked toward the trees. Nothing moved. I waited and listened. No footsteps, no branches shifting. I assumed it was an echo. The basin had a curved shape, and sound sometimes bounced off rock faces in strange ways. I went back to packing my food. When I picked up the metal cup, it tapped lightly against the stove. A moment later, from deeper in the trees, I heard the same metallic tap. That time I stood up. I walked a slow circle around my camp, scanning the ground and the tree line. I called out once, thinking maybe another hiker had come in quietly and was setting up out of sight. No answer. The area looked empty. I told myself it was an animal knocking something loose or stepping on debris. Sound travels strangely in open timber. I had heard similar things before, and they always turned out to be normal. Dusk came quickly after that. The temperature dropped into the 40s. I shut down the stove, stored my food in a canister, and moved everything close to the tent. I did not build a larger fire. The dry ground and old wood around the cabins made me cautious. Once it was dark, the silence became heavier. No wind at all. Even the birds were gone. I sat inside the tent with my headlamp off to let my eyes adjust. That was when I heard the lighter again. Click. The sound came from the direction of the cabins. I stayed still and listened. Click. It was not an echo. The timing was too uneven. Someone or something was producing the same short metallic snap. I turned on my headlamp and stepped out of the tent. The beam cut through the trees, but showed only trunks and shadow. I walked a few steps toward the cabins, then stopped. I did not see any light source or movement. I went back to the tent and zipped it closed. About 20 minutes later, I heard the metal cup sound again. A small tap, then another, like someone testing the edge against a rock. The distance sounded closer than before. My heart rate picked up, but I forced myself to think through the possibilities. Another person moving quietly. Someone camping nearby who had watched me set up. Or a person living in the abandoned cabins who did not want to be seen. I turned off my headlamp again and waited. Around full dark, the forest gave me a new sound. Hello. The word came from the trees to my left. It was my voice. Same tone, same pace, the same way I naturally say it when calling out on a trail. I did not answer. I did not move. I sat still and listened to my breathing slow down. The The voice did not repeat. What I heard fit something I already knew about. Ravens and some other birds can mimic human sounds. People in the Sierra talk about it, especially near old camps where birds have learned noises from years of human activity. I had heard recordings of ravens copying tools, alarms, even short words. The pieces started to line up. The clicks, the cup sound, the single word. I stayed awake a long time that night. I heard the lighter click once more, and a faint metal tap after that. No footsteps. No branches breaking. Nothing that sounded like a large animal or a person moving on the ground. I slept lightly and woke at first light. The forest looked normal in the morning. The cabins stood empty. No sign of anyone else. While packing, I walked a slow circle around my camp to check for animal tracks. That was when I found the footprints. They came from the trees on the uphill side and stopped about 15 feet from my tent. Bare feet, human shape, 5 toes, but the proportions were wrong. The toes were long and thin, spread wide apart, and the front of the foot was much broader than the heel. The impressions were shallow but clear enough to follow for several steps before they faded into rocky ground. I crouched and studied them carefully. They were not animal prints. Not a bear, not a raccoon, not anything with claws. They looked like human feet that had spent years without shoes, with toes that had spread for balance. The length was about the size of a large adult foot. I walked toward the cabins and checked the ground around them. More partial impressions showed in soft patches of dirt near the collapsed structure. Whoever had made them had been moving quietly between the trees and the buildings. That explained everything from the night. Someone was living there. A long-term squatter, possibly someone avoiding contact, moving barefoot to stay silent. He had watched me arrive, stayed hidden, and copied the sounds from my camp either to test my reaction or to push me out without confrontation. The single word in my voice was likely him repeating what he had heard me say earlier when I called out. I packed quickly after that. I left no trash and no food behind. I wanted nothing that might draw attention or suggest I planned to return. The hike back to the truck took about 40 minutes. The trail climbed out of the basin and then crossed a low ridge before descending to the road. Halfway up the ridge, I stopped to catch my breath and take a final look back at the camp. That was when I heard it. Wait. My voice again. It came from the trees below me, at the edge of the basin. I did not look for movement. I did not answer. I continued walking at a steady pace until I reached the truck. On the drive out, I passed a weathered sign near the junction with the highway that I had not noticed on the way in. It warned that abandoned mining areas in the region were sometimes occupied by transient individuals, and that visitors should avoid camping near structures. The experience made sense once I accepted that explanation. A person living alone for a long time, avoiding contact, using sound and distance to keep strangers away. Bare feet for silence and mobility. Mimicking simple noises to create uncertainty without revealing his position. I reported the site location to the local ranger station when I reached town. They told me they had received similar reports from that basin over the years. I never went back to that camp. I still explore old mining sites, but I stay clear of cabins, and I pay close attention to signs that someone else might already be living there. In remote places, the difference between empty and occupied is not always obvious, and the person you cannot see may be listening much more closely than you think. The survival trip started as a requirement, not an adventure. It was part of our outdoor leadership class. 3 days in a designated forest section with no phones, no GPS devices, no outside contact. We were given a topographic map, a compass, basic gear, and a set of coordinates where we were expected to establish a temporary camp. Our instructor explained the boundaries, the safety protocols, and the emergency signals. 3 short whistle blasts meant distress. That rule was repeated several times. If we heard it, we were to answer with 3 blasts and prepare to assist. There were 6 of us in my group. We had trained together for weeks. We practiced land navigation, fire building, shelter construction, and first aid. We learned to read contour lines and estimate distance by pace count. By the time we stepped off the gravel access road and into the tree line, I felt prepared. Not confident in a careless way, but steady. The forest was dense mixed woodland. Tall pines rose above a layer of hardwoods. The ground was uneven, covered in leaf litter and old fallen branches. Visibility was limited. After about 30 yards, the road disappeared behind us. Sound carried differently under the canopy. The air felt cooler, damp with the smell of soil and sap. The first day went smoothly. We navigated by compass bearing, corrected twice when we drifted too far east, and reached the marked clearing before late afternoon. The clearing was small and irregular, likely formed by a few old trees falling years before. Sunlight reached the ground in angled strips. We set up a tarp shelter using paracord and 2 sturdy trunks. We established a cooking area and dug a small latrine at the required distance from camp and water. That night was quiet. We rotated watch shifts as instructed, more as a training exercise than from fear. I took the second shift. The forest settled into its night rhythm. Insects hummed. A distant owl called once. Leaves shifted in a light wind. Nothing unusual. The second day required a navigation exercise. We split into pairs and traveled to pre-assigned waypoints within a defined perimeter. My partner and I moved carefully, checking our bearing often. The terrain sloped downward into a shallow ravine with a dry creek bed. We identified a distinctive rock formation that matched the map and logged our location in a notebook. We returned to camp before dusk. The temperature dropped faster that evening. A cold front had moved in, something we expected from the forecast given before we surrendered our phones. We ate a simple meal and reviewed the next day's extraction plan. We were tired but in good shape. I was not on watch when the first whistle sounded. It cut through the dark with sharp clarity. 3 short blasts. I opened my eyes at once. For a moment I thought I had imagined it, part of a dream blending into waking. Then I heard it again in my memory. 3 quick, evenly spaced notes. The person on watch must have heard it too, because I heard our whistle respond. 3 blasts from our camp. The sound seemed small against the trees. We waited. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no crashing brush, no additional signal. 10 minutes passed. The forest noise returned to normal. I told myself it could have been a mistake. Maybe another group farther away. Maybe an instructor conducting some test we had not been told about. Then it came again. 3 short blasts. This time from a different direction. I sat up fully. The direction shift was clear. The first had come from our west, deeper into the forest. The second sounded closer to the north. Our whistle answered again. Silence followed. I checked my watch. The time between signals was not exact, but roughly 10 minutes. My mind started measuring angles and distance without meaning to. If someone was moving, they were circling. If they were stationary, the sound was bouncing strangely through the trees. The third set of blasts came sooner. Same pattern. 3 clean notes. They were not panicked or irregular. They were controlled. We answered again. I noticed something then. There was no rustling, no breaking branches that would suggest a lost hiker pushing through undergrowth. The forest remained still between signals. The next blast came from yet another direction, this time behind the slope near the ravine we had crossed earlier in the day. My chest tightened. The pattern suggested movement around us. Not random, deliberate. This continued for hours. Every 10 to 15 minutes, 3 short blasts. The direction shifted each time, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. We responded to every one, as trained. No one approached. No one called out. No light flickered between trunks. By midnight, none of us were pretending to sleep. We stayed low and kept the fire minimal. The sound of our own breathing felt loud. The whistle would come, clear and precise, then vanish into stillness. I began to analyze the sound quality. It was not faint. It carried cleanly, which meant the source was within a few hundred yards at most. The tone remained consistent. Same pitch, same force. It did not waver the way someone exhausted might. Around 3 in the morning, the blast stopped. No final signal. Just absence. Dawn came gray and cold. None of us had slept more than short stretches. We checked the perimeter of our camp cautiously, looking for footprints or disturbed brush. The ground was layered with dry leaves. Any clear track would have stood out. We found nothing unusual. No fresh impressions, no broken twigs that had not been there before. At first light, our instructor arrived earlier than scheduled. He was alone. He approached from the southern boundary trail, visible well before he reached the clearing. His expression changed when he saw our faces. We must have looked exhausted. He conducted a standard check, scanning our setup, noting our condition. Then he asked why we seemed on edge. We described the whistles in detail. The timing, the shifting directions, the duration. He listened without interruption. When we finished, He explained something that settled in my stomach like a weight. No other student groups were assigned to that sector. The forest area had been divided carefully to avoid overlap. Instructors were stationed at fixed points well outside our perimeter. None of them carried whistles. Communication between staff was handled by radio, not sound signals. He confirmed there had been no search and rescue operations, no reported missing hikers, no authorized presence in our grid. The forest section was technically public land, though remote and rarely visited. He acknowledged that possibility with a measured tone. We packed up under his supervision and hiked out along a marked trail rather than navigating independently as planned. As we moved, I kept scanning the tree line. In daylight, the woods looked ordinary. Sunlight filtered through branches. Bird calls resumed. Nothing hinted at what had happened hours before. Near the northern edge of our assigned zone, about 300 yards from where our camp had been, the instructor stopped abruptly. On a narrow patch of damp soil near the dry creek bed, there were footprints. Not ours. The tread pattern was different from any boot in our group. The impressions were recent. The soil was still slightly compressed with defined edges. The prints moved parallel to where our camp had been. They did not approach directly. They traced a loose arc before veering back toward thicker growth. There were no additional signs. No discarded items. No campsite. Just a line of prints that suggested someone had walked slowly, deliberately, around our position during the night. The instructor documented the location and later reported it to park authorities. We learned afterward that a man had been arrested in a nearby county weeks later for stalking campers and hikers. He carried a metal whistle among other items. He had no fixed residence and moved through wooded areas for extended periods. The pattern described in his case matched what we experienced. He would signal distress to draw attention, then reposition when groups responded, observing their reaction. There was no record of him physically attacking anyone, but several reports described similar whistle incidents. Knowing that explanation did not erase the memory of that night. The sound of those 3 blasts still feels sharp in my mind. Not chaotic, not desperate. Controlled and patient. We had followed protocol. We had responded as trained. What unsettled me was not the possibility of danger alone, but the realization that someone had been close enough to hear our breathing in the dark, choosing not to reveal himself. The forest that felt like a classroom during the day became something else after sunset. Not haunted, not supernatural, just open and indifferent. A place where a person with quiet intentions could move without being seen. I passed the course. I continued studying outdoor leadership. I still carry a whistle when I hike. 3 short blasts still mean distress. When I hear a sharp sound echo through trees, even now, my body goes still before my mind catches up. I chose the same lake because avoiding it felt worse. 1 year had passed since my wife died. The date had weight. She had loved this place for its quiet mornings and cold water. We used to drive up every summer, park under the same cedar trees, and carry our gear down the narrow dirt path. The trail curved through brush and opened to a wide stretch of shoreline where the water lay flat in the early hours. I had not been back since her funeral. I told myself I was going to honor her. I knew I was also testing myself. The drive took 4 hours. I left before sunrise. The highway was empty. I kept the radio off. I did not want distraction. I wanted to sit with the day. When I turned onto the gravel road that led to the lake, my chest tightened. The ruts were deeper than I remembered. Recent rain had carved shallow channels in the earth. The forest looked the same. Tall pines, damp soil, the smell of sap and old leaves. I parked in the same clearing where we used to park. The campsite was not an official one. It sat about 50 yards from the water, on slightly raised ground. From there, the lake spread out wide and still. No cabins, no docks, no other cars. I checked for signs of recent use. No tire tracks beyond mine. No fresh fire rings. The place looked empty. Setting up the tent felt familiar. My hands moved without thought. Stakes into soil. Poles through sleeves. Rainfly clipped down. I set a small folding chair near the edge of the water. I brought a cooler, a lantern, a sleeping bag, a tarp, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I kept things simple. I did not build a large fire. Just enough to boil water and cook. The first day passed without trouble. I walked the shoreline. I found the flat rock where she used to sit with her feet in the water. I sat there too. The surface reflected the sky. A few insects hovered above the reeds. Once, I heard a fish break the surface. I felt a steady sadness, but it was clean and expected. No panic. No strange thoughts. When the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature fell fast. I ate, cleaned up, and crawled into the tent. I slept deeply. The second day felt heavier. The date mattered. It was the exact day she had died. I woke before dawn and watched the sky change from black to gray. A thin layer of mist floated above the lake. I brewed coffee and held the cup in both hands. My mind replayed hospital rooms and the sound of machines. I let the memories come. I had promised myself I would not push them away. I spent the afternoon gathering small pieces of driftwood and stacking them near the fire pit. I found one of her old hiking sticks in the back of my truck. I had forgotten it was there. The wood was worn smooth where her hand used to grip it. That hit me harder than I expected. I sat in the chair for a long time, looking at the water, thinking about how she used to call my name when I wandered too far down the shore. That thought followed me into the evening. After dark, the forest changed. The wind picked up. The trees made a low, steady sound. I stayed inside the tent with the lantern dimmed. Around midnight, I began to hear something that did not fit the usual night noise. It was faint. A thin sound stretched across the water. At first, I thought it was wind catching in branches. Then I heard it again. It sounded like my name. I lay still and listened. The sound came from across the lake. It was soft, almost shaped by distance. I told myself it was my mind. Grief can shape random noise into something personal. I knew that. I had read about it. Auditory hallucinations are common in people who have lost someone close. The brain tries to fill absence. The whisper came again. My name. Not loud. Not clear. Just enough to make my heart rate climb. I unzipped the tent and stepped out with the flashlight. I swept the beam across the water. Nothing. The surface was black. The far shore was a dark line of trees. I turned off the light and stood there. The sound did not repeat. I went back inside and closed the zipper. I lay on my back and stared at the fabric ceiling. I felt embarrassed at myself. I told myself I needed sleep. The whisper returned, closer this time. It did not come from across the water. It seemed to move along the shoreline, sliding from left to right. I tried to match it with natural causes. Wind through reeds. Water against rocks. An animal call distorted by distance. Each time I built a logical explanation, the sound shifted. It was subtle, but it tracked along the edge of the lake as if something were walking slowly. By 2 in the morning, I was fully awake. My mouth felt dry. I kept the lantern off. I listened. Around 3, I heard a separate noise. A distinct crunch of weight on damp soil. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. They circled near the tent. I held my breath. I told myself it was a deer. Deer move quietly, but not silently. They step, pause, step again. This pattern fit. I repeated that explanation in my head. The steps stopped near the entrance. I watched the zipper. In the faint light leaking through the fabric, I saw it shift. It moved down about an inch. Slow. Controlled. Not a quick tug. The metal teeth separated just enough to create a narrow gap. My body reacted before my thoughts caught up. I grabbed the flashlight and snapped it on. I pushed the zipper up and stepped out in one motion. No one stood there. No animal. The clearing was empty. The trees were still. The beam of light cut through the darkness and found nothing but trunks and brush. My breathing was loud in my ears. I scanned the ground. The rain from earlier in the week had left the soil soft near the water. I walked a few steps forward and angled the light downward. I saw impressions in the mud. Human footprints. Bare feet. Clear toe marks. A defined arch. The prints started about 10 feet from my tent and led toward the lake. They did not come from the water. They went to it. I followed them with the flashlight. Each step was spaced evenly. No sign of running. No sign of dragging. The last print stopped at the edge where mud met water. Beyond that, nothing. No return path. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark surface. The explanation formed slowly. Someone had been there. Not my wife. Not anything impossible. A real person. The lake was remote, but not sealed off from the world. A drifter. A camper who had arrived on foot from another direction. Someone who had seen my truck earlier and waited until late to approach. The whisper could have been a human voice carried across water. Sound travels strangely at night. A person across the lake might have called out, testing whether I was alone. When I responded by stepping outside, they might have moved along the shore, staying just out of sight. The footsteps near the tent were not imagined. The zipper movement had a physical cause. A hand had touched it. The prints led into the lake because that was the fastest way to erase a trail. If someone waded in and moved along the shallow edge before circling back into the trees, the water would swallow the evidence. By morning, wind would disturb the surface. No trace. I did not sleep after that. I packed as the sky began to lighten. My movements were controlled but fast. I did not want to be there when full daylight revealed more details. Before leaving, I walked the perimeter once more. I found another set of prints farther down the shore, partly smudged. They led into thicker brush that connected to a narrow game trail. That trail could lead to the main road if someone knew the terrain. When I drove out, I checked my mirrors often. I did not see anyone following. Back home, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They told me the area sometimes attracts transient people who avoid established campgrounds. They advised not camping alone in isolated spots. In the days that followed, I thought about the whisper. I am certain now that grief shaped the sound. The brain can turn wind and distant noise into a familiar name. The footsteps and the zipper were real. The footprints confirmed it. The lake did not swallow a ghost. It hid a person who did not want to be seen. I still think about how close that person stood to me while I lay inside the tent. Close enough to touch the zipper. Close enough to watch. The anniversary trip did what I needed it to do. It showed me that my mind can bend under loss, but it also reminded me that the world holds real risks. The voice was mine, carried by memory. The danger was human. I will return to the outdoors again, but not alone, and not without choosing a place where I can see who stands near my shelter in the dark. I took the old trail because I wanted to get back before dark. The main route curved wide through the valley and added almost 2 miles. I had already spent the morning pushing through early snow, and the sky had that flat winter look that meant the light would drop fast. The shortcut cut straight through a stretch of state land that used to be maintained years ago. It was still marked on my map, just faded and labeled as seasonal. Late November had come early that year. 3 or 4 inches of packed snow covered the ground. The air was dry and cold enough that each breath felt sharp in my nose. The forest was quiet in the way winter forests are quiet. No insects, no leaves moving, just the sound of boots pressing into snow and the slow creak of trees. I hadn't seen anyone all day. The trailhead lot had been empty when I arrived. That didn't bother me. I prefer hiking alone. The old trail was narrower than I expected. No fresh footprints. The path was visible only because the trees opened slightly along the route, and the ground dipped where people had walked years ago. I checked my compass often. The shortcut ran mostly west, climbing gradually along a ridge before dropping toward the parking area. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Then I noticed another set of tracks. They ran along the right side of my path, about 6 feet away. At first glance, I assumed deer. The shapes were narrow and pointed, pressed deep where the animal had stepped through the crust. What caught my attention was the direction. The tracks ran exactly parallel to mine, moving the same way I was going. I stopped and looked back. My own footprints stretched behind me in a single line. The other trail matched it almost perfectly, never crossing, never drifting toward trees or brush. Deer don't move like that. They wander, stop, turn, cut across. I told myself it had happened earlier. Maybe the animal had been traveling the same direction before I arrived. That made sense. I kept walking. After another 15 minutes, I checked again. The tracks were still there. Same distance. Same spacing. Still running beside me. I stepped off the trail and walked 10 yards into the trees, then angled back toward the path. When I returned, the parallel tracks were still present, now beside my new line of footprints. I crouched and studied them more carefully. They were deeper than mine. The stride looked longer. The shape no longer looked like hooves. At that point, I assumed I had misread the earlier section. The snow had crusted and refrozen overnight, which can distort impressions. I stood, adjusted my pack, and kept moving. I didn't like how quiet the woods felt. The terrain began to climb. The light faded faster under the thicker trees. I checked my watch and realized I had less than 2 hours of daylight. When I looked down again, the tracks had changed. They were clearly bipedal. Each print showed a long oval shape with a deeper heel, and a narrow front. The stride stretched far beyond mine, nearly twice the distance between steps. Whatever made them moved with long, steady motion. They still ran parallel to my path. My pace slowed without me meaning to slow it. I stepped to the left side of the trail. After about 50 yards, I crossed back to the center. The other line remained at the same distance, adjusting with mine. At that point I stopped and listened. The forest held its winter silence. No wind, no movement, just the faint sound of my own breathing. I walked faster after that. The ridge took longer than expected. Snow deepened in shaded areas, and the old trail dipped and curved more than the map suggested. By the time I reached a small flat area, I knew I wasn't making it back before dark. I carried a winter kit for that reason. I chose a spot near a cluster of trees that broke the wind and packed down a platform with my boots. The parallel tracks ran past the clearing and disappeared into thicker woods. I avoided looking at them too long. Setting up the tent gave me something to focus on. Stakes went in slowly through frozen ground. My hands stiffened even with gloves. The temperature dropped fast once the sun slid behind the ridge. By the time I crawled inside, the light was gone. I melted snow for water, ate quickly, and lay back in my bag. The forest felt empty again. The tight space of the tent helped. Nylon walls made the world smaller. Sometime later, I heard the first sound. A slow crunch. Not the quick scatter of an animal. Not the light stepping of a deer. This was heavy and measured, the sound of weight breaking through crusted snow. It came from somewhere behind my head. I held still and listened. Another step, then another. The movement circled wide around the tent. Each step spaced far apart, steady and controlled. I tried to slow my breathing. The sound paused. I stayed motionless for several minutes. When my chest moved again, the crunch resumed, now from a different direction. It continued like that for hours. Slow steps. A wide circle. Silence whenever I shifted or breathed too deeply. At one point the steps came closer. Close enough that I could hear snow sliding against fabric where the wind pushed it loose. I expected the shadow of something against the tent wall, but nothing touched it. No sniffing. No scratching. No sudden noise. Just walking. Around and around. I slept in short pieces, waking each time the sound stopped. Each time it started again only after I moved. Morning came gray and cold. I unzipped the door slowly. Tracks covered the clearing. They circled the tent so many times that the snow had been packed into a shallow trench. The path ran in a wide ring about 10 to 12 feet from the tent walls. The prints never crossed inward. Not once. Each step showed the same long stride I had seen on the trail. I followed the ring until I found where the tracks entered the clearing. The line came from the direction of the ridge, joined the circle, and left the same way. No hesitation. No approach to the tent. No sign of curiosity. Just circling. I packed quickly and started down the trail. The parallel tracks returned beside mine within minutes. This time I understood what I was looking at. The impressions showed the outline of winter boots. Long, narrow soles with a worn heel pattern. Deep because the person carrying weight had been moving fast or carrying a heavy load. The stride looked long because whoever made them was much taller than me. They stayed parallel because the person had been walking off the trail, staying hidden among the trees. The circling around my tent made sense once I thought about the distance. Whoever it was had kept a wide perimeter. Close enough to watch. Far enough to stay out of sight and out of reach of a headlamp. They had stopped when I stopped moving because they were watching for signs I was awake. They never approached the door because they didn't need to. They had been there all night. About half a mile later the old trail met a logging road. Fresh tire tracks cut across the snow. A pickup was parked at the bend. A man stood beside it, facing the woods. He was tall, heavy winter gear, large boots. He did not wave or move toward me. He simply watched as I stepped onto the road and walked past him. Inside the truck bed were several orange trail cameras and a large backpack. Later, at the ranger station, I learned the state had hired a wildlife survey contractor to monitor winter movement along the ridge. He had been running cameras overnight to track deer migration and large predators moving through the corridor. He had noticed my footprints crossing into the area late in the day. He spent the night following my position to make sure I didn't wander off the ridge or get lost in the dark. He kept his distance to avoid startling me or interfering. The long stride came from the snowshoes he had been wearing earlier, then boots once he reached packed areas. The deep prints came from the equipment he carried. He circled my camp repeatedly to confirm I was stable and awake at intervals. If I had shown signs of distress or stopped responding to movement, he planned to approach. He never came closer because I never gave him a reason. The old shortcut cut through an active survey zone that wasn't marked on my map. I went back a week later to retrieve the cached gear I had left near the ridge. My old footprints were gone. One wide circle remained around the spot where my tent had been. Packed hard, clean, precise. It stayed 10 feet away from where I had slept. All the way around. My name is Miguel Alvarez. In March of 2021, I took my 12-year-old son on his first real backpacking trip. We chose Big Bend National Park because I wanted him to feel distance and quiet, the kind of quiet you cannot find near towns or roads. I had hiked there years earlier, and I remembered the desert stretching wide and empty, the air dry and clean, the nights dark enough to see every star. I spent weeks planning. I studied maps, marked a remote backcountry zone, and checked water sources even though we planned to carry most of what we needed. I wanted the trip to be simple but real. No crowded campgrounds, no vehicles nearby, no noise. Just us, walking into open land. The hike-in was slow but steady. The desert in March looks calm, but it works on you. The sun feels stronger than it should. The ground shifts between hard rock and loose gravel. The air dries your mouth faster than you expect. My son did well. He asked fewer questions as the hours passed. The silence began to settle around us, the way it always does out there. We reached our site in late afternoon. It sat near a low ridge of dark rock, with a shallow wash cutting through the area. No trail markers, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently. That was exactly what I wanted. The first night passed without anything unusual. Wind moved across the rocks after midnight, and a distant coyote call echoed once and then faded. My son slept hard. I woke several times out of habit, checking the shadows and the horizon, but everything stayed still. The second day, we explored the area without packs. We climbed the ridge, looked across miles of empty land, and found old animal tracks pressed into dry mud near the wash. The sense of isolation was complete. No planes overhead, no distant engines, no human sound at all. We ate early that evening and hung our food bag from a rope looped over a rock shelf about 30 yards from the tent. There were bears in the park, though sightings were rare, and smaller animals could chew through anything left on the ground. The sun dropped behind the ridge faster than expected. Desert light fades quickly once it touches the horizon. I was sitting near the tent when my son pointed toward the ridge line across from us. A man was standing there. He was about 200 yards away, just above the slope where the rocks met the sky. He was upright, facing directly toward our camp. No pack, no walking stick, no visible movement. At first I thought he might be another backpacker who had come up from the other side, but the longer I looked, the less that made sense. Anyone hiking that terrain would be moving, adjusting, scanning the ground. This man stood completely still. I raised my arm and waved. He did not respond. I watched for several minutes. The distance made details hard to see, but his posture never changed. He did not shift his weight or turn his head. He simply remained there, facing us. I told myself he was resting, or looking for a route down, or waiting for someone. Still, the lack of movement bothered me. My son kept glancing at him while we finished cleaning up dinner. The sun went down. The ridge darkened. The figure became a darker shape against the fading sky. He stayed there until I could no longer see him. That night I felt more alert than usual. The desert was quiet again, but it felt different, as if the space around the tent had narrowed. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a faint scraping sound. At first I thought it was wind moving the rope. Then the sound came again, steady and controlled, not random. Something was pulling on the food bag. I reached for my headlamp and stepped out of the tent, expecting a coyote or a ringtail. Animals in Big Bend are cautious, but persistent around food. The beam landed on the rock shelf. The man was standing there. He held the rope in one hand, pulling it down slowly, testing the tension. He was the same figure from the ridge. Same height, same still posture, now close enough that the light showed his face. He did not look startled. He did not flinch when the beam hit him. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he released the rope. The bag swung back toward the rock. He turned without any sign of hurry and walked away from the light, moving across the wash and into the darkness beyond the ridge. His pace was steady and silent. Within seconds, the beam showed only empty ground. I stood there for a long time listening. No footsteps. No shifting rocks. Nothing. I checked the food bag. The knot had been loosened slightly, but nothing was taken. Whoever he was, he had been working carefully and quietly. I did not sleep after that. I kept the headlamp near my hand and watched the horizon until the first gray light came up behind the eastern hills. At sunrise, I packed everything quickly. I did not tell my son the details. I told him someone had come too close to camp during the night and that we were heading out early. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. I watched every ridge line and every low cut in the terrain. We saw no one on the trail. At the ranger station, I reported what happened. The ranger listened without interrupting and wrote down the location and the time. His expression did not change, but he nodded once when I described the man watching us from the ridge before coming to the food. There had been 3 theft reports that month from remote backcountry sites. In each case, campers said a man had watched them from a distance during the evening. Later that night, he approached their camp and took food or gear. No one had been harmed, but the pattern was consistent. The ranger believed the man was living illegally somewhere in the backcountry, moving between remote areas and avoiding contact during the day. Water caches and abandoned supplies could keep someone alive out there longer than most people would expect. They had increased patrols, but the terrain was vast and difficult to cover. We drove out of the park that afternoon. My son talked about the hike, the stars, and the silence. He did not know how close a stranger had come while he slept. I still think about the way that man stood on the ridge, watching without moving, and then returned hours later without a sound. The desert feels empty when you look across it, but distance can hide anyone who knows how to use it. In a place that wide and quiet, someone can observe you for hours without you ever knowing they are there. That trip taught my son what real wilderness feels like. It also reminded me that isolation does not mean safety. Sometimes the only other person for miles is not another hiker passing through, but someone who has been watching and waiting for the dark. There were 6 of us, and the plan sounded simple. A quiet bachelor weekend on private land that belonged to one guy's uncle. No neighbors, no campground rules, no crowds. Just woods, beer, a fire, and 2 nights before our friend got married. The land was supposed to sit about 30 minutes from the nearest town, somewhere off a dirt road that did not even show up on most maps. We met in the afternoon and drove in 2 trucks. The paved road ended sooner than I expected. After that, the drive turned rough. The dirt road narrowed and dipped through low spots where rain had carved grooves into the clay. Branches brushed the sides of the trucks. Dust hung behind us and settled on the windshield in a thin film. We passed no houses, no mailboxes, no fences. The uncle had described the place as a clearing near a bend in a dry creek bed. When we reached it, I felt a small drop in my stomach. The clearing was wider than I imagined, almost like an old logging site. The ground was flat but hard, packed from years of use. Tall trees surrounded it on all sides. The canopy blocked most of the sun. It was late afternoon, yet the clearing already felt dim. We unloaded fast. 2 tents went up near the trucks. One larger tent went a little farther back for the bachelor and 2 others. I set mine near the edge of the clearing where the trees began. The soil there was softer and darker. It smelled damp, like old leaves. I remember noticing how quiet it was, but at first I did not think much of it. The drive had been loud. The wind through open windows had masked everything. Once the engines shut off and the doors closed, the silence stood out. No insects. No birds. No wind. I have camped enough to know that woods are never silent. Even in winter there is some movement. A rustle. A chirp. Something. Here there was nothing. It felt like someone had pressed mute on the world. We tried to ignore it. We set up a fire pit with rocks from the creek bed. One of the guys brought firewood in the back of his truck. We stacked it carefully and lit it before dark. The fire crackled, and that sound felt too loud against the still air. Smoke rose straight up, not even bending. As the evening settled, I kept listening for the usual signs of night life. Frogs near water, crickets, the hum of something alive. The creek bed was dry, but even dry ground holds life. I heard none. The trees stood still. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, though the sky was clear. We ate and drank. The mood stayed light. Laughter bounced off the tree line and faded quickly. I remember looking beyond the fire into the dark and feeling that the trees were closer than they had been earlier. I blamed the light from the flames. Fire makes shadows move and distort depth. By 10, the temperature dropped. We put out the fire and zipped ourselves into our tents. I lay on my back and stared at the thin nylon above me. My sleeping bag felt warmer than I expected. The air outside was cool, yet the inside of the tent held heat. I left the top vent open to let air move. The silence grew sharper after the fire died. It was not just the lack of insects. It was the absence of any distant sound. No far-off traffic. No dog barking from a farm. Nothing. I do not know what time it was when I heard the first step. I had not fallen fully asleep. My mind drifted in and out. Then I heard it. Crunch. A slow shift of weight on dry leaves. I froze. I told myself it was one of the guys stepping out to use the woods. Then I waited for a zipper to open or close. I heard none. Another step. Crunch. A pause. Then another. The sound moved along the outside of the clearing, not rushing, not sneaking. Just walking at a slow, steady pace. My chest tightened. I sat up slowly and listened harder. The steps circled, always just beyond the tents. Not close enough to brush the fabric, but near enough that I could tell they were within a few yards. I reached for my phone and checked the time. A little after midnight. The steps continued. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The spacing between them felt measured, like someone taking careful strides. The ground in that clearing had patches of dry leaves and patches of bare soil. I could hear the leaves compress and shift under weight. At some point I realized something that made my stomach drop. The sound did not match boots. There was no scuff of tread, no heavy thud. It was lighter, flatter, like skin against leaves. I unzipped the tent just a few inches and listened from that gap. The sound passed behind my tent and moved toward the others. I saw no flashlight beam, no shadow. Then I heard a zipper open from another tent. I waited for someone to step out and break the tension. No one did. The steps continued for what felt like 10 full minutes. They never rushed. They never approached the trucks. They stayed around the tents in a loose circle. My heart beat so hard that I could feel it in my ears. I thought about animals. A deer would move faster. A raccoon would scurry. A person trying to scare us would likely laugh or run. This was none of that. At some point the steps stopped. Not fading away. Just stopping. The silence returned, thicker than before. I did not move for a long time. When I finally unzipped the tent fully and stepped out with my flashlight, I saw the others doing the same. No one said anything. We just swept our beams across the clearing. That is when we saw the marks in the soil. Bare footprints. They circled all 3 tents in a wide ring. The impressions were clear in the softer dirt near the trees. Each print was long and narrow. Longer than my foot by at least 2 inches. The heel was thin. The toes were close together, almost like they had pressed straight down without spreading. I knelt and placed my hand near one. My palm looked small beside it. The arch was deep, meaning whoever made it had full weight on the foot. We checked our own feet against the prints. None matched. The bachelor wore a size 10. I wore 11. These looked closer to 13 or 14, yet too narrow to be normal for that length. The prints kept circling, then broke away toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. We followed with our lights. The impressions were clear for about 40 feet, moving in a straight line. Then they stopped. There was no turn, no sign of a jump. The ground ahead was soft enough to hold another print, yet there was nothing. It looked as if the person had taken one more step and vanished. I forced myself to look harder. I widened the beam and scanned for disturbance in the leaves. I noticed something then. A faint track to the right, almost hidden, where the ground sloped slightly downward. The soil there was firmer. A person stepping carefully could avoid leaving a clear mark. I followed that direction slowly. About 10 yards in, I found a partial print on a patch of damp soil near the dry creek bed. It was the same shape. The creek bed had deeper sand. In that sand I found more prints, but they were lighter, as if the person had begun to move faster and place less weight on each step. Beyond the creek, the land rose into thicker brush. It would be easy for someone to navigate through it if they knew the area. The uncle's land might have been private on paper, but it was not fenced. Anyone local could have walked through it for years. The pieces came together as the night wore on, and we stayed awake until dawn. The silence made sense. If someone had been moving through the area before we arrived, wildlife would have cleared out. The lack of insects can happen when temperatures drop suddenly or when the ground has been treated in the past. The uncle used to log the land. Chemicals might have lingered in the soil. As for the prints, the length and narrow shape suggested a tall, thin adult. Someone who did not wear shoes, or someone who removed them to move quietly. The slow pace, the circling pattern, the deliberate stop before the tree line all pointed to a person checking us out. Watching, testing our awareness. In the morning light, we found something else. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden under leaves, sat an old folding chair. The fabric was faded and torn. It faced the center of the clearing, not the road. It had likely been there for years, but none of us had noticed it when we set up. That chair explained the silence in a way I did not like. The land was known, used, maybe by a hunter, maybe by someone who preferred to stay off the map. We packed up after breakfast. No one argued about staying another night. On the drive out, about a mile from the clearing, we passed a narrow trail that split from the dirt road. It was worn enough to show regular use. I later learned from the uncle that a man had once leased adjacent land for trapping. The lease ended years ago, but he had never fully stopped visiting the woods. He lived alone in a small house near the highway. He walked long distances and did not own a vehicle. That matched the prints. That matched the patience of the steps. Nothing supernatural happened that night. No one vanished. No one was harmed. But someone walked around our tents in complete darkness, barefoot, slow and steady, studying 6 sleeping men in a clearing that felt cut off from the world. The silence was not magic. It was the kind of quiet that comes when something human moves through a place and everything else steps back. In the summer of 2016, I was 22 and trying to prove I could make something serious. I was a film student, and for our final project I convinced 3 friends to help me shoot a short documentary about abandoned fire towers in northern Minnesota. My name is Rachel Kim, and at the time I believed that if we found the right location, the story would shape itself. We drove north from Duluth before sunrise, heading toward the forests near the Boundary Waters. The air changed as we left the highway. It felt cooler and cleaner. Pine and damp soil replaced the smell of asphalt. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a narrow dirt track with weeds brushing the sides of my car. We parked at what looked like a washed-out trailhead. According to the Forest Service website, the tower we wanted had been closed for years. Access was listed as restricted. The trail was supposed to be gone. It was not gone. It was faint, but it was there. A strip of flattened grass leading into thick trees. We carried cameras, tripods, batteries, and enough water for a full day. Mosquitoes gathered around our necks the second we stepped into the shade. The forest felt dense and quiet in a way that swallowed sound. Our boots sank into soft ground. We followed the path uphill, passing old blaze marks on tree trunks. Some were fresh enough to show pale wood under the bark. After about an hour, the structure came into view through the branches. It rose above the canopy, gray wood and steel against the sky. I had expected rot and sagging beams. Instead, it stood straight. The staircase looked solid. No missing steps. No obvious damage. It did not match the image of something abandoned for years. The clearing around it was cleaner than I expected. No fallen limbs across the entrance. No thick brush covering the base. The door at the bottom was closed but not locked. I felt a rush of excitement, the kind that comes before you capture something rare. We started filming immediately. I circled the base with my camera, recording details of the bolts, the grain of the wood, the old signage that warned visitors about lightning strikes. When I stepped onto the first stair, it held my weight without a sound. We climbed slowly. The height became obvious halfway up. The forest stretched in every direction, dark green and unbroken. Wind moved through the treetops, but the structure barely swayed. The cab at the top had glass on all sides. Some panes were cracked, but none were missing. The door opened easily. Inside, the air felt warmer than outside. It smelled faintly of sweat and something metallic. I noticed the blanket first. It was folded in the corner near the wall. Not old, not faded. A modern fleece with a store tag still attached to one edge. On the narrow counter beneath the windows, there were food wrappers from energy bars and a plastic jar of peanut butter. The jar was half full. The lid was on tight. There was also a notebook. Spiral-bound, blue cover, edges worn from handling. I picked it up without thinking. The The first pages were filled with dates and short entries written in neat print. Weather notes, mentions of distant canoeists on the lakes, comments about hearing engines at night. The entries stretched back at least 4 months. The last page had a date from 2 days earlier. The final line read that they came back last night. Not animals. My chest tightened. The phrase did not feel like a joke. It felt controlled and deliberate. I scanned the earlier pages more carefully. There were repeated references to movement in the trees below after dark. Lights flashing briefly between trunks. Footsteps circling the base. Whoever wrote it believed someone was watching them. We did not discuss it in detail. No one needed to say that this was not part of our plan. We filmed a few more shots, close-ups of the notebook, the blanket, the wrappers. My excitement had drained. The space felt occupied, even though we were alone. I had the clear sense that we were standing in someone else's room. We packed quickly. I left the notebook exactly where I found it. We descended in silence. At the base, I scanned the clearing again. I tried to remember how it had looked when we arrived. The ground was a mix of dirt and pine needles. I did not see anything unusual. The hike back felt longer. The forest seemed tighter around us. I was focused on my footing when one of my friends tapped my shoulder and pointed behind us. In a patch of damp soil near the edge of the trail, there were fresh boot prints. Deep tread marks. The pattern was distinct and sharp. They were not ours. Our shoes had flatter soles, lighter impressions. These prints overlapped older leaves that had not been disturbed when we passed earlier. I was certain they had not been there before. The direction of the prints matched ours. They followed the same narrow strip through the trees. I crouched and touched the edge of one mark. The soil was still soft. Whoever made them had stepped there recently. We continued walking, but the rhythm had changed. I kept checking behind us. I listened for snapping branches or shifting brush. The woods stayed quiet. No engine noise. No voices. Only wind moving high above. When we reached the car, relief hit me first. Then I saw the back window. The dust that had settled on the glass from the drive up was disturbed. Words had been traced with a finger. You shouldn't have climbed it. The letters were large and deliberate. Each stroke clear. The message covered most of the window. I felt my face go cold. We had been gone for around 3 hours. The road leading to our parking spot was narrow. No other vehicles were there. I forced myself to look around carefully. Tire tracks in the dirt showed only my car's path in and out. No fresh tracks. No cigarette butts or trash. Nothing else seemed moved. The message was the only sign. We did not call the police. In that moment, it did not feel like a crime. It felt like a warning from someone who did not want attention. I took photos of the window with my phone. I wiped the words away with my sleeve before driving. During the long trip back south, I kept replaying the sequence in my head. The intact stairs, the recent food, the detailed notebook, the fresh boot prints, the writing on the glass. It formed a simple pattern. Someone had been living in that tower for months. They used it as shelter, maybe as a lookout. The entries about people in the trees were likely about hikers or canoeists. The line about not animals suggested they believed someone was approaching at night. That someone might have been other campers. It might have been us on our way up. The prints on the trail meant they had returned while we were inside the cab or shortly after we left. They followed at a distance, staying out of sight. They reached our vehicle before we did, either by cutting through the woods on a more direct path or by moving faster along the trail. They had time to write the message and leave without being seen. The absence of extra tire tracks suggested they were on foot. In the weeks that followed, I researched the area more carefully. There were reports of seasonal workers squatting in old structures to avoid rent. There were also stories of people seeking isolation after losing jobs or relationships. Nothing about violence. Nothing about missing persons linked to that specific site. It fit the profile of someone who wanted to be left alone. We changed the focus of our documentary. We did not use the footage from that day. I did not want to expose the location or attract attention to it. The experience shifted my understanding of abandoned places. Some are not abandoned. Some are occupied by people who exist outside systems, who depend on remaining unseen. I still think about the handwriting in the notebook. It was steady, organized, not frantic. The message on my window was also controlled. It was not a threat. It was a boundary. We crossed it without knowing. I never went back to that fire tower. I have no doubt someone was there that day, watching us climb, waiting for us to leave. They chose not to confront us face to face. Instead, they made sure we understood. We did. My name is Daniel Mercer. In October 2018, I took a short contract with the state to verify storm damage in a remote section of the Ochoco National Forest in Oregon. A late summer wind event had pushed through the area and brought down sections of old pine. The maps showed an abandoned logging network that had not been maintained for years. The job was simple on paper. Hike in, document blowdown, check for hazard trees near old access routes, and hike out. 3 days solo. The trailhead sat at the end of a gravel road that faded into ruts and rock. There was no signage, only a rusted gate bent open years earlier. The air smelled dry and cold, the way high desert forests do in October. Patches of yellow grass showed through the dust. Most of the trees were old ponderosa, tall and spaced wide, with deadfall scattered everywhere from the storm. I logged my start time on a paper form, locked my truck, and began the hike. The old logging road was easy to follow at first. After a mile it narrowed and disappeared under brush and fallen limbs. I used GPS and a compass to stay on the right line. The area had the quiet that comes from distance. No aircraft, no distant traffic, no chainsaws. Only wind moving through needles and the occasional creak of trees rubbing together. By late afternoon I reached the point I had marked for camp. It sat near a bend where the road flattened and opened into a small patch of bare ground. Someone had used the spot years earlier. A few cut stumps, a shallow fire ring filled with dirt, and a line where vehicles had once parked. Now young pines and bitterbrush pushed in from all sides. I set a small tent, cooked a simple meal, and logged coordinates for the next day's survey points. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. Wind moved through the dead crowns of damaged trees and made a hollow sound that carried across the slope. It was steady, not violent, just enough to keep the forest in motion. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke once to a branch falling somewhere downhill. After that I slept until sunrise. The second day was long but routine. I moved through several plots, measuring trunk diameters, photographing snapped tops, and marking clusters of blowdown that would block future access if anyone ever tried to reopen the route. Many of the fallen trees were gray and dry, already losing bark. The storm had not been recent. Some damage likely dated back years. By late afternoon clouds rolled in from the west, and the wind picked up again. I returned to camp tired, ate, and crawled into my bag before full dark. I remember checking my watch when I turned off my headlamp. It was just after 9. I woke at 2:40 a.m. At first I thought the wind had changed. Then I realized what had pulled me awake. It was the sound of an engine. It was distant but clear. Not a vehicle moving, but one idling. A low, steady vibration carried through the trees. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I stayed still inside the tent, listening. The forest went quiet again, except for the wind. After a minute, the engine sound returned. Same place, same steady idle, then it shut off. That cycle repeated for the next 20 minutes. Start. Idle. Stop. No headlights cut through the trees. No doors. No voices. The nearest maintained road was at least 8 miles away, and the old logging network around me was blocked by years of growth and fallen timber. No standard vehicle could reach this area without hours of cutting. I checked my GPS to confirm my position. I had not misjudged distance. I stayed awake until nearly 4, but the engine sound stopped and did not return. At first light, I packed a small day load and walked toward the direction where the sound had come from. The ground sloped gently down into a basin thick with young trees. After about half a mile, I began to see disturbed soil. Tire impressions cut through the dust, clear and sharp. They were recent. The edges had not crumbled, and pine needles lay crushed and still green where the tread had passed. I followed the tracks another quarter mile. They ended at a clearing I had not seen on my maps. The clearing held the remains of an old pickup truck. The body was burned down to bare metal. Tires gone. Glass gone. The frame sat low in the dirt, as if it had been there for years. Rust covered everything. I walked around it slowly. There were no fresh footprints nearby. No trash. No signs anyone had camped or worked there recently. I placed my hand on the engine block. It was warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than the cold morning air. The metal held heat like it had been running not long before I arrived. I stepped back and stood still for several minutes, listening. Nothing moved except wind in the brush. There were explanations. Someone with equipment could have towed another vehicle through the night. A portable generator might create a similar sound. But the warmth did not match the condition of the truck. That engine had not run in years. I documented the location with photos, marked the coordinates, and returned to camp without stopping. That afternoon, I decided to end the contract early. The remaining survey points were deeper into the basin, farther from any reliable exit. I packed everything before sunset and staged my gear for an early departure. While breaking camp, I noticed something in the dust along the old road. Boot prints. They were not mine. My tread pattern was narrow and worn at the heel. These prints were wider, with a deep lug pattern, like heavy work boots. They came from the direction of the basin. I followed them back toward the clearing. After a short distance, I saw a second set alongside the first. 2 people had walked the same path. The prints overlapped my own trail in several places. In some spots, they stepped directly into my footprints. That meant they had come through after I walked out that morning. The tracks continued past my camp and then turned back toward the basin. I did not sleep that night. I packed everything and started hiking out before dawn. The hike back took most of the day. I stopped often to listen. Once, about 2 miles from the trailhead, I found the same boot prints again crossing the old road behind me. They did not follow all the way to the gate. When I reached my truck, nothing was disturbed. No damage. No signs anyone had been there. I drove straight to the district office and filed a full incident report with my survey notes and photos. Law enforcement visited the area 2 days later. They located the burned truck and confirmed the engine block still held residual heat under the hood insulation, which can happen if someone places a portable heater or runs a small concealed engine nearby. They also found evidence of a hidden camp deeper in the basin, including fuel containers, cut branches, and food packaging. The conclusion was illegal activity, likely a remote operation using portable equipment. The repeated engine sounds matched a generator being cycled at night to avoid detection. The burned truck had been used as cover or storage. The people involved had moved through the area after hearing me during the day and tracked my camp to assess whether I was alone. The state closed that section of forest temporarily and transferred the investigation to federal officers. I did not return to that contract. Since then, I do not ignore sounds in remote areas, and I do not assume distance means isolation. The forest was not empty that night. Someone had been working in the dark, close enough to watch where I walked, close enough to stand in my tracks and wait for me to leave.